So I'm Justin, and I work at Google. And for the past 3 years, I've been working on Android specifically, the operating system. So it's a privilege to work on a product that reaches billions of users, but it's also a huge honor to come here to places like this and talk with people that are just as passionate and use it in a different way than we do. So I'm really excited to be here, and I'm excited to talk about design as haiku. And I have to admit, I was pretty scared of putting this as the title because I wasn't sure how many people would just be like, yeah, okay, no thanks. But there's a lot of practical stuff out there, and I think that working on software, there's just not many different lenses or looking to other places as understanding like what we do and why we do it. And I think that those are two of the most important things that we can think about. So just a quick show of hands, how many people here have designer in their actual title? Just raise your hand. Okay, cool. So the rest of you, I'm assuming, does not have designer in your title. So that's good, because I was worried this would scare off non-designers. But so design is haiku, finding poetry in the product design process. What does that even mean? Why do we want to find poetry in the product design process? I think it starts with this quote. The language of the human heart is poetry. And this is from Krista Tippett. She's an author, podcast host. Barack Obama in 2014 awarded her the National Humanities Award. So if someone like her is talking about something like this, I think it's pretty important to listen to. The language of the human heart is poetry. I think, language and human heart. And when I'm looking at this, these seem like the two most important things that we can have. Language, the way we communicate, the way we express ourselves, and the human heart, right? What we feel, the connection between you and me. Pretty important, language and human heart. So I'm looking at this like, well, language of the human heart, like what is that? It's poetry. So just really quickly, just shout it out. Types of poetry that you know of. Sonnet. Haiku, cheater. Ode, okay, there you go. Yeah, free verse, limerick, tonka, maybe, that's a stretch. So there's a lot of different types of poetry, right? But I think specifically, haiku is actually maybe the most important. And I think this is because it has direct correlation with design, but also because it's the simplest form of poetry, right? It's the first type of poetry that kids learn in like the 3rd grade poetry unit in elementary, right? It's so simple, a kid can write it, and yet we also have masters of haiku that write haiku that make us feel amazing things, right? So there's three things, 3 principles, 3 requirements that actually make a haiku. So the first is structure, and this is just representative, but it's 17 syllables. A haiku has to have 17 syllables, and these 17 syllables appear in 3 stanzas of 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and 5 syllables. If you do a little bit of research, you'd be like, I don't know, Justin, the haiku I read don't fit this. It's because the way the Japanese language works is obviously different than the way the English language works, and so when you read translations of Japanese haiku, it's often doesn't follow the structure because the spirit behind it, it's like really tough to translate this type of thing. But it's, Japanese haiku, 17 syllables, so it's a requirement. I think it's the most important requirement of haiku, that we fit the poetry into this format. The second part is seasonal reference. This is probably less known and doesn't have to be in the first stanza, it's just illustrative, but haiku are about seasons. They're about time. And there's actually like a set list of words. So if I say pumpkin, I'm talking about fall, and things like that. So there's actually a set list of words that we can use in haiku as a seasonal reference. And the last one is juxtaposition. This one is the toughest one to kind of explain. But the literal translation for the Japanese term of this, I grew up in Japan, sorry, that's helpful context. The Japanese word for this, it literally translates to a cutting word or cutting character. And so an integral part of haiku is that there's actually a juxtaposition, that there's a contrast, and that somehow there's a bridge between these two things. So structure, seasonal reference, and juxtaposition. And you're just like, how does this relate to design? I'm getting there, I promise. This was the one emoji that I promised, by the way. I'm glad we got that out of the way. Okay, so let's take a look at these and really see how they fit. So the first one is structure. So talking about structure, and I've broken down structure into a few principles that we can apply to design. And these principles I wrote in haiku. Very simple form. They don't have the things I just talked about other than fitting in the syllable form. But so haiku prescribes a form of capture to express an abstract notion. Some great product examples of this. Vine. You have 6 seconds to create a video. Anything can go in that, right? Twitter. You have 140 characters to say something. Doesn't matter what you say, 140 characters. Early on, Instagram, just a square, right? There's prescribing a form of capture. Not all photos have to be squares, right? But they're prescribing a form of capture to express an abstract notion. You can say whatever you want to, but it's by putting these constraints, putting the structure in place, that things really start coming out of it. If you want a terrible example of this, flight apps. Apologies if you work on one. I just have not seen a great app from airlines because the airlines think they can do everything, right? You don't necessarily book a flight directly through an airline, you might, but the app is trying to do everything, right? So what's the form of capture? Like, what are you prescribing to kind of limit that, to put structure? The thing about a simple structure is that it belies the complexity of composition, right? The bar of design is, of course, right? So it's 15 and 20 iterations. It's a messy process, right? You keep iterating, finally get to a result, and the bar is you look at it and you say, of course. So people not familiar with the process had no idea it took a really long time to get there because it's just so obvious, but it's not obvious from the start. So a simple structure belies the complexity of composition. So how do you get there? You start by removing non-essentials and combine 2 things into one. I think this is really the essence of design, right? It's reductive. The design process is reductive. You're not adding things. Well, the process is actually additive. You add features. There's requests for things you need to do. There's all these things. But design inherently, like haiku, is reductive. You're taking away things. You're combining things to make it fit inside the structure that you have. So how does this apply? This is Terminal 3 in the Narita Airport in Japan. And what's unique about this is that it's a terminal specifically for domestic, low-budget travel. So the design firm that worked on putting this together had some interesting constraints. They had half the typical budget, and the next destination for passengers was like half a mile away. So what they did was they laid out this track material on the ground, you can see, because it was a really cheap material to use. And suddenly now they have a theme of like track, athletics. So they combined wayfinding onto the track, right? You can see kind of the symbols on the ground for like where people need to go. And then because they've established this, you can see at the top that black tarp type thing. That's more signage. That's like the things that you see out like wrapped around tennis courts. Seems like cheap and tacky, but now it fits right into the context. And the blue couches on the side are from a company called Muji, which make like minimal essential items, and it's a Japanese company as well. So now you have this beautiful output of really simple things. The complexity, right, belies the result. And they have this quote, the design firm, "Our goal is to consolidate 2 or more functionalities into one pursuit of economic reasonability." That's a great quote. That's like the goal of design, right, is to simplify, to combine things, to consolidate. So a really beautiful terminal, but it was only possible because they embraced the structure that they were given, and they kind of took that haiku principle and applied it. So what does this mean for you? Think about what are the syllables that make up the stanzas of your haiku, right? Like what are the components of what you're working on? Where are there too many? This is, I think, the main struggle for where I work, right, is when I find a design is failing, it's often because it's trying to do too much, and it's trying to take too much into consideration and do too many things, give too many options. So where are there too many syllables? And more importantly, why is this happening? Like, what can you do about it? Identify the problem. And lastly, like, how might you combine them, right? You have a lot of things. How can you consolidate 2 into 1? The next one is a seasonal reference. Seasonal reference is a universal, instantly relatable marker of context. I think this was a driving force behind material design, right? The goal to give users cues that they understand, right? If I see this behave in that way, or this element go over there, I can track it. When I see this element, I know what it does. I know it's a button. I can push it. It's a universal, instantly relatable marker of context. That's the point of a seasonal reference. But the other thing about seasons is that they change, right? We get to the end of spring, and we actually want summer. We get to the end of summer, we actually want fall. So changes over time refresh the experience and build on the past. I think Instagram is actually a pretty good example of this, of starting one thing and just evolving and growing to become a new thing without losing kind of the core essence of what they're originally about. But you need to have change. Things need to be refreshed. This is just the natural thing. We have rhythms, right? We have rhythms in life, and this just embraces those rhythms and puts them into an experience. The last really interesting thing about seasonal reference is not everyone will understand, which gives more depth to those who do. So earlier I said pumpkin, and you guys know that's fall, right? If I said Milky Way, I've seen a lot of blank faces, right? In Japan, Milky Way is attributed to fall. So if you knew that, you know there's a connection that we have, an understanding. If you don't know that, it's lost on you, right? Like it doesn't make sense. You lose meaning of that. So one of the, I think, biggest places we can look to find seasonal references is in music. So a recent album came out from Jay-Z. It's called 444. And there's one producer on the entire album. His name's No ID. And No ID gave an interview in Rolling Stone. And there's a song, the title track of Jay-Z's album is a confession, an apology to Beyonce for cheating on her. But that wasn't a given that was going to happen. So No ID, this producer, in the interview, he's talking about how he created that song for Jay-Z to express that in. He says, I went and made a piece of music that would box him into telling that story. The whole piece of music was created with me knowing, I'm going to make you say it on this song. He says, like, I boxed all these parts in again. So you're already seeing two things. One is structure. He created a structure for Jay-Z to express himself in, right? But the second part is a seasonal reference. So here's what I mean by that. I'm going to try playing two audio samples. So I'm going to play the Jay-Z song first, and listen to the music in the background. Closed captions are on, so you can read the lyrics too. You kind of already know what it's about. Okay.
Apologize, often womanized, took for my child to be born, see through a woman's eyes, took for these natural twins, to believe in miracles, took me too long for this song, I don't deserve you, I harass you out in Paris.
It's just a really short clip, but you can see through the lyrics that what the song is about and my context given to you. But the song that's playing in the background was sampled from this song.
Why do I find it so hard?
So I'm not sure, it's kind of hard playing them separately, right? But the important thing to know about the song that's sampled from is that song is actually about infidelity. So when No ID gave Jay-Z the track and said, I want you to make this song, and Jay-Z heard this, knowing that that song is about infidelity, it gives him, like, he already knows what he's going to put into the song, right? So No ID created the structure and added a seasonal reference, and then you get this output of the finished song. So what's your seasonal reference on what you're working on? What does it say, and who is it speaking to? You don't have to speak to everyone. Sometimes it's really great to speak to everyone, right? First thing about seasonal reference is universal, relatable, marker of context, but you don't have to speak to everyone all the time. And is it due for a change? All right, last one, juxtaposition. This is one of my favorite tweets of all time. We get it, poets, things are like things are like other things. It's like, kind of like the basis of poetry. But here's the thing about haiku. Traditional Western poetry uses simile and metaphor to make comparisons, but haiku wants to present the world just as it is. So instead of using comparisons, the haiku simply positions things next to each other. So it's not a stretch. You're not trying to say something. You're just presenting two things side by side, and that natural relationship that they have is already there, right? Like, people understand it. It's the effect of the juxtaposition and not the things that they're composing next to each other. So I think this is maybe the principle that we can get from that. Look to find contrast within opposing concepts, not disagreement, right? I think so often we're asked to serve two different purposes, or cover all options on the spectrum, or whatever it is. And sometimes you have to cut down, right? You got to get the extra syllables out of there. But this, I think, comes in combining syllables and bridging two different ideas and concepts together. So look to find contrast within opposing concepts, not disagreement. I think this is a great example of this. This is the molecule. It's an air purifier, a very expensive air purifier. It has military-grade filtration system, but it also sits in your living room, right? So how do you communicate these two things, right? Amazing technology, home product. Military-grade filtration, home product. And so it's a really beautiful piece of hardware, but on one hand you have this brushed steel cylinder. It's pretty intimidating if you don't know what it is, especially, right? What they did is they juxtaposed that with just a simple leather strap, right? And the leather strap is to carry it around. But the beautiful thing about this is it also signals the relationship, right? Machine, human, interaction point, leather strap. It's like the invitation. It's a signal, but it's also a juxtaposition between the two pretty different things. And they just put them next to each other. So what are the tensions that you hold together? What are the things that seem to be opposing each other? How might they go side by side? And is this connection jarring or subtle? Sometimes it's best for things to be really integrated. Sometimes it's best for things to really stand apart, still working together. Okay, so remember the very beginning of the talk? The language of the human heart is poetry. And this talk has been a lot about the language aspect, right? The structure, the seasonal reference, the juxtaposition. And I already said, anybody can write a haiku. I wrote a bunch of them, which is actually very hard for this presentation, right? A kid can write it, right? 3rd grade poetry class, first one, haiku. Anybody can write it. This is a quote from Jorge Luis Borges. So sorry I butchered his name. Very important Argentinian writer. At the end of his life, near the end of his life, he was going blind, and he gave a series of lectures at Harvard. And he's speaking to the class of students, and he says if he has to define poetry, poetry is the expression of the beautiful through the medium of words artfully woven together. And then he's like, that might be fine for a dictionary textbook, but it's feeble, right? There's something far more important. I think what he's talking about is the human heart, right? That's the part that's really important. Billy Collins from Haiku in English, The First 100 Years, he says, haiku is both easy and impossible to define. Dictionary definitions fall well short of accounting for haiku's mysterious power to cause in the reader's consciousness a sudden shift, literally a new way of seeing. Doesn't this seem like the role of design is to give people a new perspective, to give people a perspective? This is something I've been thinking about a lot. The best things in life can never be quantified, but sometimes described. We live in a world that quantifies everything, right? Especially in software. It's all about quantity, quantity, quantity. I wonder if it's less about quantity and more about capacity. You can't quantify, no one knows the number of hugs they've had in their life, but I bet you remember a few and the way they made they feel in really important times in your life, right? The best things in life can never be quantified, but sometimes described. This is another quote from Jorge, same lecture. He says, we know poetry so well that we cannot define it in other words, even as we cannot define the taste of coffee, the color red or yellow, of the meaning of anger, love, hatred, of the sunrise, of the sunset, of our love of our country. So things are so deep in us that they can only be expressed by those common symbols that we share. Doesn't that sound like the language of the human heart? Historically, the arts have had a really big impact in culture and the way we think, the way we live, movements. And today, I think a lot of that can also come from tech. And we're all in software in one way or another. and if the language of the human heart is poetry, and we're building software, we have this opportunity for culture and influence, it's something that I think we should strive for. So I hope that as we continue building things together, that we will strive for fluency in the language of the human heart. Thank you very much. I'm on Twitter, but if you really actually want to talk, email is the best way to go. Twitter followers are quantity, but emails can't be quantified. Just kidding.
You have time for questions?
Cool. If any of you have a question, feel free. It's dangerous. Yes?
I hope I can say it. The idea of, I don't know, I'll just throw it out there, releasing code quickly as opposed to quality code. Can you talk about that just in brief?
Yeah, the
The
difference.
opposing.
Yeah, like, got to get it out there fast versus need to make sure it's right. Do both. I'm just kidding. Simple. You have to understand, I'm coming from a UX perspective, so maybe, but I think it's a really fine line, and just practically speaking, I think the margin for error has become less and less. As far as like putting out something that's not polished, I think the price you pay putting out something unpolished, even for the sake of testing, is pretty high. I think you kind of only have one shot. So I think there are ways to mitigate that, like who are you releasing quickly to? But I think it just goes back, right, of like confining into that syllable structure, right? Like haiku's not free verse, and there's a difference. As soon as you go one syllable over haiku, it's not a haiku anymore, right? So I think that, that has to happen with focus. It can take 5 minutes to prepare for an hour-long presentation. It takes an hour to prepare for a 5-minute presentation, right? So I think it's just really prioritizing and knowing what you want to do, and maybe that can kind of help the stages. I don't know, that's a terrible answer, but I gave it a shot. Yeah.
Can you talk about how you're applying this to some of the work you're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mentioned this is kind of recent in thinking about how to do this, so I'm still also thinking through how to apply it. I think the number one thing is I kind of mentioned, one of the ways this concept came about is I was getting really frustrated with eng and upper level feedback on things where I felt like they were asking for too much. One of the drawbacks or challenges rather, of working on a platform is you kind of have to be agnostic, so you kind of have to cater to everyone, and that can result in needing to do a lot of different things or keeping it too open. And anyway, I was getting really frustrated with feedback of like, oh, okay, this needs to be changed. And I was like, okay, if we change that, we have to change all these things. And it's actually a system, right? So similar to how haiku is strung together in the system, if you want to say something and you have 5 syllables to say it, and the thing you really want to say is 6 syllables, you got to rephrase the whole thing if you're trying to make it fit into 5, right? You have to choose different words to express the same thing. So I think it's been giving me a frame of reference to explain kind of how the system has to change if you want to tweak one thing about it. That's kind of like in working relationships. I think actual implementation-wise, again, there's a lot of requirements and a lot of things you have to fit in. So I think trying to simplify that and realizing where that's going too far, that's doing too much, we just have to scale back. It's hard to give concrete examples just because of the stuff that we're working on now, but in the process of doing less and realizing that, it's helping you realize where you're kind of going over.
You said you grew up in Japan, so how does that influence your designs, or does it influence your designs? How do you see it being differently as far as how they design in Japan and how we do?
Yeah.
Can you
Should I
just
repeat the
repeat
question?
that
The question
question?
was, or do you wanna-
You said you grew up in Japan, so I'm just wondering, how does that influence your designs when you're designing for Google? And also, how does the design difference in Japan relate to the US?
Yeah, that's a great question. So before Google, when people were looking at my portfolio, they said that they could tell that I was from Japan. I'm kind of skeptical of that, but I also can understand where they're coming from. I think Eastern design principles tend towards minimalism, but also if you go to Japan and look at their graphic design of like packaging, it is crazy. I think it's super ugly. So that's a weird like difference. I don't know how to resolve that, but their like physical products or their spaces are super beautiful, and I don't know what's going on there, but different part of the culture, I guess. But I think overall, so I use the company Muji as an example. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's like minimal essentials. And in the US, it's seen as like a luxury or like premium brand. And I think that might be partially because of the novelty. In Japan, it's like basics, and really nice basics, minimal. But I think that kind of explains the difference in like Eastern versus Western philosophy towards design. And Muji, they have this one tag of like talking about their cleaning products, and it's like stows away neatly and works hard when needed. And that's like such a nice way of thinking about your cleaning products. In America, it's like kills 99.9% of germs. You know, there's like that difference. Anyway, so I think that it trends towards minimalism, and I think that there's a certain heart in it that's a little bit different.
Super interesting brain food talk, thank you. I'm wondering, do your teams agree on the rules for the haikus you're creating metaphorically at Google, or even the fact that there should be rules in that way?
Yeah. I think that at a certain level, design is often phrased as like problem solving. And I think that the problem solving is the easy part. I think agreeing on the problem is actually the harder part. Because if you don't quite agree on the exact same problem that you're solving for, the solutions might be 1 or 2 degrees apart. But if they're solving for different things, that's when you get disagreement. And you don't want to go down too far that path because you have to start all over again because you're solving for a different problem. So I think that this principle of figuring out what you're actually solving for and putting it in those constraints, and then when you get asked to, it's like, well, changing the problem that we're solving for is changing the constraints. And I think that expressing that early on, it's a lot about communicating, okay, what's the problem that we're solving for, and getting buy-in and agreement on that. And solutions are kind of assumed. Like we'll work it out if we can agree on the problem. Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah. Cool. Cool. Thank you so much.